I've covered a lot of really tough stories over the last quarter century and conflicts and natural disasters and things like that. One thing that's always struck me, Professor, is that there seems to be a little bit of a difference between natural disasters and conflicts, for example. And maybe it's not that relevant a difference, but in conflicts, this idea that you are being targeted somehow, that there is, humans are targeting other humans in this case, in that case, is particularly psychologically devastating.
Yes.
With natural disasters, obviously, they're terrible. Katrina was terrible, but there is sometimes a sense that we were all sort of in it together as well. We were all targeted, if you will, together by this natural disaster. Do you draw a distinction when you have these cataclysmic events that occur in society, such as a war or a natural disaster? How do you sort of think about the difference psychologically long term?
Even in terms of disasters, when I'm talking about them, it's like no two tornadoes strikes are the same, no two hurricanes are the same. It's like every disaster occurs in its own unique socio-political, economic, cultural context. And when you're talking about, the idea of being targeted, or, it's a very natural human response to want to blame, and to want to reach out and like there's this question of why did this happen? How did this happen? Why me? Why us? Why now? And this is a critically important question for people to answer. And the more effectively they are able to answer that question in some way that fits with their worldview, the better able they'll be able to adjust in the short and long term. And one of the best examples I can give of that, in the case of like Hurricane Katrina, it could be, if my worldview, if I believe in a God that is very loving and very involved and, has a plan for me, and then this horrible, horrible circumstance happens, how do I reconcile that? How do I make some sense of that? What does this mean that this happened? That this challenge is in front of me. And in terms of, like a conflict, say, where you're being targeted, where there's like human involvement, again, it's kind of like, how is it explained? I could explain it in the sense of I'm a good person and there's a bad person who's targeting me, or there's a bad group of people who are targeting me. And for the worldview kind of sense, that's a way we can explain things. And again, it's very natural in disasters. We want to blame, for something like Katrina and the levees breaking. Who's to blame for that?
Right.
We knew that was going to happen at some point. Why was nothing done? Why were we not more proactive? And blame is a way of discharging psychological pain. But it's not necessarily it's an understandable one, but not necessarily a helpful one as far as like helping people to cope in the immediate short term and the long term.
Well, why do you think humans sort of gravitate towards that then? Because I imagine there's a strong desire to want to self-soothe and self-heal. And the idea like, hey, I need to understand what happened here. If it's not helpful to do that psychologically, which is what I think you're saying, why do we gravitate toward that?
I think we have to have a reason why. And that seems to be, in my mind, and that's something that we've encountered in various different disaster contexts. It almost kind of like, I think of throwing you up against the wall where you're kind of like, I don't understand, like this is so much bigger. I don't even understand. I don't fathom how this could have happened. How do I make sense of that? How do I process that, and how do I kind of go forward with that? How does that affect my worldview going forward? How do I explain if I believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, which many people do? How do I explain, something horrible like a Hurricane Katrina happening to so many good people? And that it really causes such a major disruption for people, and how they answer those questions goes a long way toward, how they ultimately respond or recover.
Do you think psychologically then it is, if you're helping someone in the aftermath of some terrible thing like that, do you lean into this idea of the mechanics of what happened here? Is that important, or is it more important in the aftermath of something to just say, look, don't let this shatter your worldview. These things happen. There's more of a randomness to it. How do you think about it?
There's nothing like a disaster to make people feel confused, disoriented, to make people question their sense of significance or purpose. Resilience is the common response that you would expect, that people have this tremendous capacity, for bouncing back and recovering from things. And we're looking for ways to help facilitate that. And there's also this idea of post-traumatic growth, that some people will go through these horrible, horrible experiences, and somehow, maybe the disaster brought them closer to their spiritual beliefs. There's nothing like a disaster to help us reorient to what is truly important. A disaster gives us a more immediate sense of, I don't want to take this for granted. We're grateful for what we have. And so even in the context of the disaster, the grief and the turmoil and all these things, we spend a lot of time studying gratitude. I think we're growing as a science is we're not just studying kind of like the symptoms, or looking for diagnoses, but we're looking for, well, what are ordinary responses to extraordinary experiences like a disaster, and helping people to understand that.
I find that's a really important point, even on a more individual level. Sometimes, even with my patients, they want some context. I'm feeling this way. Is this normal? Is this abnormal? And I think it can be helpful to in that sense at least remind them that they are not grieving alone. Because they've gone through this together, but they're not grieving alone.
Absolutely.
I want to ask about the broader relevance of this, but just as a reporter who was there, and the anniversary, do you think anniversaries are important to note, to commemorate in some way, or do they open up wounds of this terrible thing?
Something like a Katrina. So there was so much horror. And again, it can be a reminder of grief. It can be a reminder of loss. But alternatively, I think there are tremendous lessons that come from those experiences. And, as a psychologist, I try to pull even from, the very dark stuff. I'm looking for the positive, so I'm looking for, that sense of gratitude, that sense of growth. I look for a sense of lessons learned. And so for something like Katrina, it is a great example of so many things that went wrong. But I also believe that, it's incumbent upon us, as citizens to, kind of remember these experiences and, ask that kind of question: are we more prepared? What have we learned? Are we better able to deal with these kinds of disasters? There will be another Katrina. And of course, there have been other just super awful, Hurricane Sandy comes to mind, Hurricane Harvey comes to mind, Maria comes to mind. And that's the question that I always have is, are we better? Are we going in the right direction, as a culture? Are we?
And where do you come down on that? Do you think we are?
We're not learning, I think, as much as we should be, and applying it as much as we could be. There's a positive psychologist by the name of Christopher Peterson, and he boils down positive psychology into the simple phrase, other people matter. And so that was kind of his statement. And I think that is a critically important idea. And, when you look at other disasters, in some ways I feel like we're going in the wrong direction. It's we need to not just be looking out for ourselves and our own loved ones, but we need to be looking out for our neighbors, the other folks that are in our community. And ultimately, I kind of liken it to, we are all in that same boat.
Okay.
And it's not if a disaster is going to happen, it's going to be, when is it going to happen? What is it going to be? Are we ready for it? And, anywhere in the United States that you think about, and really anywhere in the world, but certainly the United States, it's like we have rock slides, mudslides, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, not to mention like house fires, extreme temperatures, so many things. There's nowhere that you can be, where you're not necessarily having to consider some of these things at some point. We're all affected by something. But there's also this idea, this illusion of invulnerability. It's like, well, I watched this on the news. This happens to other people. Like, this isn't going to happen to me. This isn't going to happen here to our community. And trying to help work through that and just kind of say, when you see something on the news, some event, it takes just a second to kind of say, am I ready? If something happened here, to my family, am I prepared for it, or what might I do? So you see like a story on the news of a house fire, and then it's taking that extra moment to kind of go, if my house were on fire, what do I have a plan? Are the folks in my family, are they prepared? Do they know what to do? And it's not about living in fear. It's about being proactive. And when we're proactive, it helps kind of rewire our brain, so that we're better prepared. If we kind of think through this and have kind of walked through this preparation, we'll be better able to function in those stressful moments like we would hope we would.
Is it predictable who you think is likely to be able to rise up in the moment and potentially be a person who's more likely to have post-traumatic growth?
Well, I think there are certain concepts that are studied in positive psychology, and meaning is one of them that is very, very important. And a lot of times when I say meaning, folks are like, what do you mean by meaning? And the modern science of meaning, it's broken down into kind of three areas. There's the worldview. There's my sense of like, how does the world work? And, what do I expect is going to happen? What is a normal day like? We all have that kind of sense of how the world works. And there's a sense of significance. And that's our, like the sense that we matter. And so sometimes people will use the word mattering. I like the word heft. It's like everybody, every human being has dignity, has the capacity for integrity. They have inherent worth. And we need to feel that. We need to feel like we're you mentioned validating kind of, someone's perspective, that they're not alone at what they're feeling and thinking is normal. And that's incredibly important. But we need to come through these events and feel like we have value. We're important. It doesn't matter who we are or what our station is or socioeconomic status or all of that. It's like we all have inherent value, inherent worth, and are we retaining that, in that process? And then the other piece is purpose, which is this kind of idea of goal direction, and so are you living your life in a way that is consistent with your values? That is critically important for people's well-being. And people often struggle in the sense of everybody else is telling us like what's important. Everybody, you get all of these messages, it's kind of like, what does your own voice say? Your true kind of internal voice say about where you should be going, what you should be doing. What were you made to do? What do you feel like you were sort of born to do? Do you feel like you're, kind of walking in that path? Those folks who have a better sense of like kind of a more crystallized worldview, they have a much better perception that they matter. They have a much better congruence, with their goals, these folks will be more resilient. They are um, more protected against things like depression and anxiety. They're less likely to use drugs and abuse drugs and alcohol. The question that I often have for people, which is like, what is your why to the how? What is the reason that you're doing all of the things that you're doing? And you mentioned your daughters. I have an 8-year-old son, and he means the world to me. And so what are our motivations? What is truly the good stuff? What truly matters? And the more in touch we are with that, the more resilient we are. And the more likely when we go through these kinds of circumstances, which we will, uh, the more able we'll be who we want to be, the more resilient we'll be, the more likely we'll be able to evolve and kind of grow from it. And so those concepts, that's what we study, and that's what we are finding to be especially important. What is it that makes human beings at their absolute best when things are at their absolute worst?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I have a sort of nature nurture question about this, but I got to tell you on a personal note, just again having covered so many of these stories, you go into a situation and you're in the aftermath of something awful that has happened, and you see some characters, some people within that environment who have just risen up. And they have become these leaders and really been very helpful in very objective ways, but just helping psychologically as well. But what was interesting to me, Professor, is that when I'd interview some of these people, I'd say, "Hey, a week ago, before this happened, if I told you you're going to be the person that's going to rise up and do this," oftentimes they would say something like, no, that's not me. I'm not that person. I'm not that sort of heroic sort of person. And yet they become that person,
right?
In the face of a challenge. And I've always wondered if that is something that they are just born with and had not yet realized, if they nurture it throughout their lives. Are the people who are those heroic figures, are they born that way, do you think?
I think they can be both. I think that's a great question. And that's something we focus on and talk about quite a bit as well, as you can be trained to operate in that kind of way. Like if you're a first responder or that sort of thing, you can be trained to kind of know what to do. And there's this danger of this kind of bystander effect, of people almost being frozen and just sort of watching things unfold. And you can be trained to overcome that or override that. And ordinarily in a disaster response, the hindsight bias, is always 20/20. But there are folks that actually kind of wrestle, like, I should have done something. Maybe they had a circumstance like where they felt like I should have jumped in there. I should have said something there. I should have been more proactive. And that kind of thinking about it very often can be associated with guilt. Again, I should have done something. Why didn't I do anything? And you're thinking about it. And for some people, you're almost priming yourself for when something does happen again, then you're in a position to do something about it. You almost have to conceptualize yourself as a person like, I'm somebody who could do that. I'm somebody, if there was an absolute need, I could, you have to believe that. You have to be able to tell yourself that. But again, it can also be trained, and it can also kind of come from that sense of maybe I'm a little disappointed in myself that I didn't respond the way I thought that I should have in this other circumstance. So when something else happens, I'm going to step in there.
Can you give a concrete example of a positive psychology practice maybe that people can incorporate into their lives that could help them survive, find purpose after a disaster, but also, as you're saying, help overcome this bystander effect?
The number one protective factor for people is going to revolve around their social support. And so making sure that you're connected to your loved ones, and these kinds of things can very much be an insulating factor. So the other people matter, I think, is critically important. I think the idea of the meaning piece, it can sound very, very difficult, but this is why I tell most folks if they haven't read Man's Search for Meaning, they should read Man's Search for Meaning. It's a life-changing read. And having this kind of sense of, Frankl talks in this book about his experiences. He was in the concentration camps during World War II, and he lost most every member of his family. And the book talks about being able to find meaning even in those circumstances. And so I had read that book originally like in 1994, and it was immediately life-changing in the sense of if he could find meaning in what I perceived to be the worst circumstances imaginable, for somebody to experience, it's like, my goodness, this is applicable to, any range of circumstances. And the research has borne that out. And so very simply for people, what I would say is to recognize your own inherent value. You have dignity and worth and value. We don't always feel that. Sometimes depression or anxiety eats away at our sense of, that we matter. But recognizing that you matter, other people matter, having that sense of like, am I listening to my inner voice? Am I doing what I feel like I need to be doing? And we all have to do things we don't want to do. But even in those kinds of times, sometimes we're able to draw a sense of value from it. There are also studies that link meaning to better prognosis in terms of like cancer, in terms of, a range of what are regarded as purely medical disorders. There's a huge mental health component to it. And so meaning, this idea of meaning, the perception of meaning, the perception that my life has value, that I know what I want my life to be about, is absolutely critical for people to, feel connected and to feel good about themselves, and is a tremendous protective and growth factor in people.
I started this podcast talking just from my own personal perspective, having covered Katrina and going there and being at Charity Hospital. When my reporting time over there was sort of coming to an end, it was, we'd been there for a few weeks, I think, at this point, into September of 2005. My youngest, my child, who was just 3 months old at the time, it's my oldest child. She's now 20 years old. Suffered a pretty bad injury,
Mm-hmm.
and I wasn't home. I was in New Orleans, and I was in the middle of a lake, essentially on a boat, and we were sort of doing this surveillance story about trying to understand what had happened there. Very hard to get a hold of us. And my wife, through, her own miraculous, abilities, was able to, get a satellite phone, call me, tell me what had happened. And my producer at the time, this man named Tommy Evans, who's this incredible guy, I was paralyzed because it's my 3-month-old baby,
Mm-hmm.
and he somehow got the boat captain to take us to the shore. Another friend of mine, a guy named Miles O'Brien, was a pilot. He helped arrange a plane to get me out of there because it was a disaster area, as you well know.
Yeah.
And I was able to land, and she's doing well, but it was a very significant head injury. But I just bring that up to say that 20 years later, like, I still think of Tommy, and I still think of Miles, and I still think of these guys and what they were able to do for me. And that mattered to me, And so, people's actions in the moment really matter. If you, Professor, could leave listeners with one takeaway about living in a world where, as we've talked about, disasters are a part of life.
Right.
I think maybe for some people, they thought I would never, be in a tornado or a hurricane or a fire, whatever. So if you want to leave listeners with one takeaway about living in that sort of world, what would it be?
I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just to kind of put it into a little bit of a capsule here, it's not if something's going to happen, it's going to be when something happens. And we just don't know what it will be or when it will be or, to what extent it will be. This is not about living in fear. Sometimes people, feel they kind of shy away from preparedness or don't want to think about it because, It's I don't want to live my life in fear and that sort of thing. And I think really in positive psychology, there's now a science of prudence, and I think it's it's kind of a simple understanding of the idea of these things happen, they're going to happen. If I haven't had something impact me yet, I'm blessed, I'm fortunate, I'm grateful, but something will happen at some point. Am I prepared? What kind of person would I want to be? My own belief is that, it's a part of our role as citizens, is to just be vigilant. We don't live in a safe world. I'm not sure we've ever lived in a safe world, and it's a matter of being prepared. It takes just 1 or 2 extra seconds. You go into a movie theater, for example, of just taking an extra note where the exit is, or, on like a plane, sometimes, they'll say, take a note where the exit aisle is, and it's kind of like, well, you actually not just want to take a note where the exit aisle, you actually want to sort of count the number of seats. Because sometimes what might happen, you could have smoke could fill the cabin, maybe you can't see a thing, and so there are extra kinds of things like that you can do that don't really take a lot of mental energy, of just kind of going like, okay, I'm just making a mental note of this is sort of the path, the exit or what have you. You want to envision, if you imagine what kind of person you want to be, you're much more likely to kind of follow through with that. And that's why I think that there's a lot of mental preparation that's important, and then the actual like physically doing it. And that's why the preparedness, not just the mental aspect, but kind of physically doing things is so essential. And so, I would just encourage people to be, more mindful. It's like, enjoy your lives, don't live in fear, but at the same time, take a few extra seconds to just kind of ask yourself, if that happened to me, would I be ready?
These are enlightening conversations for me. They really are, because I think, you look at big events like Katrina, and I think it's on a lot of people's minds. I think everybody remembers, as you say, Katrina, and they remember maybe even where they were. It was one of those sorts of events.
Yes.
But there's lessons to take that you can apply in your own life.
Absolutely.
Aside from a hurricane, aside from Katrina specifically. So, and I really appreciate you sharing those with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is quite an honor. I very much appreciate your time.